Hi, I'm Mary with Wild Roots Farm, and I'm going to show you guys how to do some prop house work. First, I'm going to start by, I have my wheelbarrow full of my potting mix, and I'm going to add some fertilizer, which is a fish meal, a bone meal, azomite, and I feel like I'm forgetting something. But then I'll mix it into my potting mix. Just really make sure you like spread it out. And I put fertilizer in here because this potting mix really doesn't have many nutrients. It's mostly coir and perlite and wood chips. So it kind of needs a little extra something. Once you feel like you have the fertilizer pretty mixed out, we're ready to fill our trays. This is one of our 144 trays. And it's important to really make sure that you pack the soil tightly into the trays. One, for when you remove the plugs, the tighter that the soil's in there, like the better your plug is going to hold together, so that when you pull it out, it doesn't just like all fall apart. So making sure that your soil mix is also kind of a little bit wet helps, because it'll go into the tray better. You can also just come in and press the soil in there a little bit, just to really ensure that it's packed in super well. If you're doing larger seeds like squash, you don't necessarily have to do this step, but for smaller seeds where you're not going to be poking that deep of holes, you'll want to do that extra step. Okay, tray is nice and full, all the excess soil's off, and now we're ready to seed. I start by, you don't ever want your seed more than like half of the seed width deep in the soil. So for something like chicories, which you Italians are familiar with, that's very dirty. You really don't want that deep a hole, because the seeds are incredibly tiny. So I just like barely poked it very deep, and that's about as deep as you want a chicory seed. Now, if you have something larger, like a squash seed, which is much, much larger, you'll want a much deeper hole. And this is more appropriate for like squash seed depth. Now, if you plant some of the smaller seeds too deep, they just will like never germinate, and they will rot in the soil, and you'll have like really uneven germination. And then the last step, once you've seeded your whole tray, is just to come in and gently like sprinkle soil over, and then just dust off. And as you're dusting off, kind of like pushing that soil in so that there's good soil contact and compaction. And then that's seeding trays. Okay, so now that I've seeded my tray, I want to water it in. And I have this very nice wand that gives kind of a wider band of watering. And I don't want it to be too high, because if it's too high, it's going to blow all the seeds out and the soil off. So I kind of dial it back, and I get it to about a width of my tray, and I just kind of gently go back and forth. And it doesn't really need, the soil mix was pretty wet, so it doesn't need too much water, but you can also just check the bottom of the tray to see if there's like water coming out. Okay, so next I want to talk about potting up. Here we have some marigolds in 144, and normally I wouldn't pot marigolds up, but we're going to pretend like they're tomatoes, which I start all my tomatoes in the 144, and we're going to pot them up to 2-inch. We used to use the larger 4-inch, but because I don't have a ton of greenhouse space, I've reduced down to this size, and things do fine in there. So I just pop up my little plant, and I know that these are ready to pot up because when I look at the bottom, all the roots are coming through. So I pop out my little guy, and I put it in my pot, which already had a little soil in it, and then just kind of fill it in and compact it down. And then this is the same size pot I do my peppers in, which they do great in there. And then the other thing that we pot up is we'll start some seeds in 288 trays and then pot them up to these 72s. So I filled my 72 tray. I didn't compact the soil too deeply because I kind of want to be able to dibble a large hole in there so that when I pop out my plug, my little celery, I can just fit it right into this hole, push it down, and kind of handy to have a little pot of soil around so that you can just really make sure that it is packed in there well, and then just continue on through your tray. Okay, so now that we've potted up the celery in the 72s, we're just going to give it a nice little delicate water, and same with the stuff that we potted up into the 2-inch pots. Peppers and tomatoes don't exactly like it super wet. So I don't water these too heavily, and I don't necessarily want to see water dripping out at the bottom of the pots. Now we'll continue on into watering the rest of the greenhouse. These are things that were seeded earlier this week, and the top of the tray is looking a little bit dry, but I always also like to check the bottom of the tray, and you'll notice that some of these are looking much drier. So I know that it's in need of water. Set up. And sometimes the soil mix really dries down, especially on super warm days. So I find that I will have to do this like 6 or 7 times just to sufficiently water them in. Whereas on a rainy day in the house, I might not necessarily even need to water. And then I'll just check the bottom again, and I notice that water is dripping out in spots, but there's still some other dry spots, so I'll just hit it with water one more time until I see water dripping out everywhere a little bit more evenly. It's important not to overwater because then you will start getting dampening off and other fungus issues. So I'm pretty happy with that. Most of it's pretty wet, and also the feel of the tray is pretty heavy. Okay, so now I want to talk about fertilizing. It's important to keep your starts happy and not stressed. So we have implemented a once-a-week fertilizing regimen in the propagation house. And this is like a pre-mix. It's fish fertilizer, a kelp fertilizer, and also like mycorrhiza. And with this, we know that we need half a cup per gallon. So I just measure out my half cup, and I'll pour it in my sprinkling can if that's what I have on handy, and I've used this plenty in the past. And then fill it with water and go ahead and water in my trays. We've also used a backpack sprayer, which is nice and handy, especially if you're fertilizing out in the field once you've transplanted. It's pretty portable. Same thing, this holds 4 gallons of water, so I would adjust my amount that I add. A new thing that we've gotten this year, I don't actually know what this thing is called, but it attaches to your hose, and there's fertilizer in here, the same stuff that's in there, and then I can just turn on my hose, and you'll notice that there's nothing, that it's clear, but the darker brown stuff starting to come up, and that is my fertilizer, and the water also looks slightly brown. And then I'll just go ahead and water in all of my trays. There's been times in the past where we've kind of let slip fertilizing weekly, and we notice a really big difference in our starts. They don't look quite as vibrant and large. They'll just start to look kind of yellow and suffer. So it's really important to get on a fertilizing regime in your propagation house, and really have somewhere where you're keeping record and track of the day that you actually fertilize. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the different tray sizes that we use here. This is a 288 plug tray. It's called that because it's 12 times 24, so there's a total of 288 individual plugs. I use these for some of my smaller things like onions and leeks, and I will also start herbs, celery, and celeriac in here, since some of those have poor germination, and then I will pot those up or just like transfer them into the larger tray size once their roots fill out the bottom of the tray. These are our 144 plug trays. Again, 144 holes. I use these for our lettuces, most of our greens actually, kohlrabi, chicories of course, and I think that's about it. Yeah, mostly for greens. And then these are our 72 plug trays. These are called wind strips. They have large holes at the bottom meant for air pruning, which is supposed to help with the health of the plant. And I use these for some of our larger brassica crops, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, cauliflower, and broccoli. But I also use these for cucurbits, so cucumbers, summer squash, winter squash. All right, so let's talk about some like lower budget ways of heating. These are our heat mats. We put them on some like bubble wrap just to help insulate the bottom, and then they get plugged in here, and we have this closed off so that water does not get in here, and then it gets plugged into a thermometer which regulates the temperature, and it's pretty simple to regulate your temperature up and down. And then at one point all of my heat mats were plugged in there, and then that thermometer is controlled by this little guy, and then you just stick that in your plug trays. And I like to stick it on the outer edge because it seems like these heat mats don't heat as well on the outer edge as they do in the middle. And then another way, so this would be like active heating in the greenhouse. Another way that I help kind of warm up the propagation house is through passive heating, which is these black jugs, 55-gallon jugs, are full of water, and they will heat up during the day with the sun, and then through the night the water will just kind of slowly release heat and help insulate the propagation house by just a few degrees, but it will help ensure that your starts don't freeze. We don't in Oregon necessarily need to actively heat our propagation house, but I know on a very cold night I might throw a propane tank with a heater on top of it. I know some houses are equipped with like a wood stove, or even using a water heater to heat benches. We're not there yet, but hopefully in the future we'll have something similar to that. Something a little cheaper is using a tank heater. Here in the States, these are used inside livestock tanks to help ensure that the water does not freeze during the winter. And one of these can simply go into some sort of bucket full of water just to help heat up the house a little bit more. All right, so as far as benches go in the propagation house, we built out these benches this year, just using simple like 2x4s with cedar top and some 2x6 for the legs. But in the past, I've done something even simpler where I took cinder blocks and just put 2x4s across. You can also simply use wooden pallets that are propped up with cinder blocks. It doesn't have to be fancy, and this certainly is a very like budget option, and usually at least pallets in the United States are easy to find free, so you don't have to build a fancy table something like this